every 2-year-old in many respects is smarter than the smartest guy in Silicon Valley is, right? I mean,
Hmm.
every 2-year-old can do things like from a very small amount of data, figure out really important new things about the world around them. Um, that just is not, and we've shown this, is not the kind of thing that any adult can do, and not the kind
Hmm.
of thing that, the super smart genius can do.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes, and welcome back to our new special series where we take a look at AI and all of the related social, economic, philosophical, and political issues. You know, Sam Altman recently got a lot of attention when he made this comment about how much energy it takes to train AI. And he said, it's a little unfair because everyone's focused on how much energy it takes to train our models, but it takes a lot of energy to train a human. And if you look at all the energy consumed by a human in the first 20 years, and you really want to do an apples to apples comparison, you got to admit that human intelligence takes a lot of energy to train as well. And I think that was partly kind of a little bit of trolling, a little bit of a intentional joke in bad faith. I think he also meant it. And it got people angry because a lot of people feel whatever your religious tradition, or if you're a secular humanist like myself, you think there's a pretty big difference between the moral salience of a human being and the moral salience of, say, ChatGPT or Claude or one of the LLMs that are just lines of code. And so that training of the human intelligence is part of the miracle flourishing of the dignity in life and the embedded web of love we live in. But there is something interesting about that, because one of the things that's so intellectually fascinating about this moment is we as human beings are attempting to create machines that can do a lot of things we can. They can think and they can reason and they can communicate and they have intelligence, whatever that is. And in doing so, we're trying to figure out how we do it and use that as a means to train them. Like, how do we learn? So how could they learn? But also they're doing it pretty clearly differently than us. And in so doing may reveal things about how we actually do all those things. So you can start to use it as a kind of comparative tool to figure out what it is that we do when we're thinking. What is it that we're doing when we're reasoning? How do we learn? How do we learn differently than machines? Is it possible to get the machine to do something that looks like learning that's very different than what we're doing? Or is their learning sort of done along the same lines as us? And so there's a million questions around this that I think are super fascinating, and one of the foremost experts on these questions, how it is that we as humans learn, what learning is, what intelligence is, how that might be mapped onto machines, is Alison Gopnik. She's a distinguished professor of psychology and affiliate professor of philosophy at UC Berkeley. She's also a cognitive scientist. She's author of numerous books. You may have heard her on other podcasts. She's a foremost expert in child learning, intelligence, and AI. And Professor Gopnik, it's great to have you in the program.
It's great to be here, Chris.
I want to start, if it's okay with you, at like some really basic levels, because I had a conversation with my mother the other day, who I love, who's watched my show, listened to my podcast. And, she was listening to an episode we did on AI. She's a little confused about certain parts. And then she just said to me, "What is artificial intelligence?" And I
Right.
said to her, well, it's an attempt to use computer code, computer programs to either mimic or replicate human intelligence. And then the next question was like, well, what is intelligence? What's human intelligence? And I actually think that's kind of an important part to start with. It's something I
Hmm.
know that you've thought a lot about and have a lot of views on, because people have now taken to throwing around intelligence as this like obvious known quantity. The amount of intelligence is going to increase, or what if you had access to this amount of intelligence that. And it's not that clear to me that we actually agree on what the definition is or even know with precision what it is. And so let's just
Yeah.
start with that. Like, how should we
Yeah.
understand this concept of intelligence?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. So, one of the things that's odd from a cognitive science perspective is that the idea that there's this thing called intelligence, that you can have more of it or you can have less of it, and as you get more of it you get to be more powerful and so forth, that just doesn't show up anywhere in cognitive science. There's a
Hmm.
little bit of IQ studies where people are doing psychometrics around the edges, but none of us in cognitive science would have that kind of model for as an answer to the questions that we're trying to ask, like how is it that children can learn as much as they do about the world around them? How is it that we as adults can do things like make inferences, reason, plan, find out about the world, right? Those are the kinds of questions we want to ask. And we want to ask what kinds of cognitive capacities, what kinds of computations would you need to do to be able to do all these things? And I can tell you one thing, nobody thinks we'll look inside of the brain and we'll find this little meter and it will tell us, oh, here's what happened. You had the magic intelligence, and that was the thing that enabled you to do all of these things. And in fact, it's even more profound than that, because one of the things we've discovered is that it's not just that there are multiple intelligences, but that they actually trade off against each other. So that the things you need to do, for instance, to explore, to learn about the world, are in tension with the things you need to do to be able to act effectively. This is the explore-exploit trade-off that people in computer science have talked about. And provably, you can't maximize both of those things at the same time. So even if you thought that you were trying to get at intelligence, it turns out that these really fundamental things that you're looking at can't be maximized at the same time. So the idea that there's some quantity that you're getting more and more of just doesn't make sense from the perspective of computer science itself. And I think there's two things that contribute to this. One of them is it's an interesting thing that comes out from development. It's very natural for people to think in terms of some underlying essence that you have more of or less of to explain all sorts of things. So we'll say something like, oh, I have very low energy today, and I was talking to someone else who had higher energy. But of course, that's a common enough way to talk, and we all understand it. But nobody thinks that if you looked inside, you'd see this thing that was called energy that you had more of or less of. So I think that's one piece. I think another piece is that there's a kind of sociological fact about it. So a comparison I've made is to nobility. So imagine you're in a feudal economy and someone says, well, why does the prince have more power than the earl, who has more power than the baron, who has more power than the common peasant? And you say, well, it's because they have more nobility. There's this nobility, and if you have more
Yes.
nobility, then you're higher up in the pecking order. And I think there's at least an argument that in an information, education, meritocracy environment, it seems very natural to people to make a similar kind of claim about intelligence.
Yeah, I want to stay on with this for just a little bit more, because I do think it's such a key part of the discourse that I find
Yeah.
actually kind of repellent.
Yes.
There is this very flattening assumption about intelligence, and it's all the people who are working on these models and selling them and talking about them in Silicon Valley are people who, by the very traditional metrics
That's
of
right.
intelligence measures, are very, very smart. They and I think they are very smart for what that's worth or what that means. But in my first book, I wrote about what I call the kind of cult of smartness, and this notion, again, a sort of sociological observation. There is this intense push to view intelligence as an ordinal quality like height.
Right.
Like, if you're standing next to Nikola Jokic, like he's 7 feet and I'm 6 feet, and he's just taller than I am. And it's amazing how often people will talk, particularly in like elite law circles, in
Right.
all sorts of elite circles, will talk about smartness and intelligence in this ordinal way. And then that has been kind of transposed onto the machines.
That's
So
exactly right.
now there's this thing about, well, this is smarter than that, and it's this smart now, and it's going to get smarter. And what if you had a thing that was smarter than or more intelligent than the best mathematicians? And I just always think like there's some real fuzziness happening here linguistically about what we mean.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So it's tempting. I find myself saying, well, look, even smart people are making this error, right? So I'm using the idea of
Exactly.
smartness. But as I say, it is amazing how little this reflects anything that's in cognitive science. I mean, cognitive science is the science of trying to understand cognition, how people can do the things that they do in the world. And there just isn't anything like this ordinal, exactly as you described, this ordinal notion of intelligence that shows up in cognitive science. And of course, for development, that's particularly vivid because every 2-year-old, in many respects, is smarter than the smartest guy in Silicon Valley is, right? I mean,
Hmm.
every 2-year-old can do things like from a very small amount of data, figure out really important new things about the world around them. That just is not, and we've shown this, is not the kind of thing that any adult can do, and not the kind
Hmm.
of thing that, the super smart genius can do. So that's a really vivid example where, in the kind of meritocratic pecking order, the 2-year-olds don't outweigh the heads of the AI programs. But from a cognitive science perspective, the things that they're doing, the things that they're capable of, are different, and in some ways they can do that kind of thing better than other things. Now, when it comes to like putting on their jackets in the morning, let alone something like having an IPO, they're really terrible. So it's
Right.
not as if those things are the same. There's also, I think, an interesting kind of biological question where, if you thought about, say, even just adaptation to your environment from a biological perspective, one thing that people have pointed out is it's not actually about dominance. It's not that some smart creatures are dominating other creatures, that's what a higher degree of intelligence or cognition allows you to do. What it allows you to do is something called homeostasis. What it allows you to do is to sustain your life in a really complicated environment. That's the great thing that we use our brains to do. So this picture, and again, I don't want to be
Hmm.
too ad hominem about it, but literally ad hominem, but it's a funny community that thinks that this is the most important value, and that you could measure people by this value, and that your authority and power in the world and efficacy is all going to be based on this value. That's a funny picture about human cognition, and not one that fits what we know from cognitive science.
You just talked about the incredible cognitive abilities of 2-year-olds, and a large part of your research has been about both childhood development and how children learn, and the
Right.
kind of both mystery and surprising miracle of how they learn and how good they are at learning, and how good, and when you sort of get down to it, let me just start with how you got interested in that question, because it's an interesting question. At some level, we take it all for granted. If when you're a
Right.
parent of a young child, you are in constant wonder at kids saying the darndest things, and also at wonder at, I remember the first time that my first daughter said a word to me, and it felt like I woke up and the toaster started talking to me. It's
Right.
like, oh my goodness, like you've just entered through this portal from non-linguistic to linguistic. This is wild. Where was your sort of early pull towards this research?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story. I did my first degree, and in fact, I'm still an affiliate in philosophy. I'm still an affiliate in philosophy. Philosophy was always the thing that I thought that I was doing, and I still, to a large extent, think that I'm doing. Um, but I'm also the oldest of six children. So I was struck from the time that as long as I can remember, by just how much my younger brothers and sisters were learning and
Hmm.
understanding. And I was always struck by the fact that when you went to read philosophy, which was my favorite thing to do then and now, children were just invisible. You could. At one point,
Hmm.
I looked at the 1967 Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and there are like 5 references to children. You could believe that human beings reproduced by asexual cloning in the 1967 Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Many more references to angels than to mothers or fathers or children or babies. Um, and that has continued to be true. Now, the deep problem that is the problem that I've always cared about most in philosophy is what you might think of as the problem of knowledge. Look, here we are, we know all these things about the world around us, and yet all that reaches us from the world are these little patterns of photons at our retina and disturbances of air at our ears. And yet we know about people, we know about minds. One of the early things that I did was what's now come to be called theory of mind. We know what other people are
Hmm.
thinking. And of course, in science, we end up knowing about things like quarks and distant planets. How is that possible? How could we do that with, a couple of pounds of gray goo in the top of our heads? That has always seemed to me to be a really profound, interesting, deep problem. And I mean, of course, it's a classic philosophical problem. And it always seemed to me like the best way to solve that problem was to see how the people what the people are doing who are actually solving that problem every day, namely
That's right.
little children. Um,
Right, they have to
and
solve for it constantly. It's all they're doing
constantly,
is wait, what just happened there? Wait, why did why did they do that?
exactly.
Why
And
what am I what's expected of me here?
we're actually doing some technical work now, talking about different approaches to AI, about the way that children seem to have this intrinsic motivation to figure out the world around them, which is just overwhelmingly. But one of the ways I put it is, scientists know the best way of figuring out the world is to do experiments, and for a 2-year-old, experimentation is all they do all the time, 24/7. Except we call it getting into everything, and we think of it
Mhm.
as how can we keep them from killing themselves while they're doing this? But it's a sign of how motivated that they are, that they will do things that will cause them bodily harm if it means that they can figure out what's going on around them. And we're trying to sort out what kind of a system would be like that. But I have to say, and there's sort of obvious reasons for this. Um, it's still so my vocation from the time I can remember is, let's take children who have been seen as being, oh, they're in the world of domestic life and women, and they're cute,
Mm.
and we think about them as parents, but they're not really a
They're not
profound.
serious subjects of study.
Exactly, that's right. And take things that we do think of as serious, like computation or philosophy or epistemology or AI, and show that children are really giving us the keys to those answers. And I think ethics, and there's lots and lots of these deep philosophical issues that are very related to childhood. And that's especially true because for human beings, that long extended period of childhood is one of the most distinctive things about us biologically. Our chimps are producing as much food as they're consuming when they're 7. We have never done that until we're at least 15, and
Mm.
many many children are not doing that um, until their 30s nowadays.
Yeah.
So it's this deep, important set of questions, and I think are especially deep because, in a way, the machine learning AI question, or at least one of those questions, is the same question. Could we get a machine to take data from the world and understand about the world as a result? And I think it's important to say that the large models, which are the things that have gotten all the attention, to get back to what is it that you mean by AI, are exactly not doing that. They're not solving that problem. And maybe I can talk some more about what I think they are doing.
Yeah, I want to hold that because I do want to talk about that. But just to
Right.
your point about what the distinctness of our species' experience of childhood. I mean, it was
Right.
always striking to me as I read about this when I was doing some research for my last book about just how long like helpless infancy is in humans
Exactly.
compared to other species. We all know that like you can watch a foal, being born and it can kind of walk in a wobbly fashion, and that we can't walk for first, depends, year and a half, 2 years sometimes, depending on the developmental trajectory. I mean, the helplessness and then the duration. And to get back to the original Sam Altman kind of trolling point, it's like, it is true. It takes a long time to
Right.
train a human, a very long time. And one of your, I think, kind of thrilling and exciting and fascinating findings is just that very young, we're almost at the kind of peak of our cognitive abilities
Right.
because of how much we have to do, even in just like a caloric sense of how much our brains are, how much
Right.
energy. Like, talk a little bit about this sort of the
Yeah.
kind of amazing cognitive performance of the 2-year-old child.
Yeah. So this gets back to the point about different kinds of intelligences. So if you think about this explore exploit trade-off, how is it
Yeah,
that
tell me about that.
yeah, so the
What's explore exploit?
So the basic explore exploit trade-off is this. Suppose you're trying to solve some problem, or you're trying to figure out a hypothesis, or you're trying to do something. One thing you can do is very quickly come to a solution that's effective and that you can implement. But that means you might be missing some other solution that would actually be better, right? Um, and if you just go out and explore, go out into the world, do all those things that 2-year-olds are doing, you're going to find out about the world. You can build a model of the world, and that will enable you to get to solutions that are much better, but are going to take a longer time. And there's this basic trade off between, do you explore? Do you consider lots of possibilities? Do you spend a lot of time learning, figuring out about the world? or do you act effectively and swiftly and in order to accomplish a specific goal? And you can't maximize both of those things at the same time. And the technique that comes out in computer science is often start out exploring and then exploit later on. And I think that applies to, brainstorming, or there's an old say about how you should write drunk and edit sober, that you start out really looking very widely and then you
Right.
narrow in. And what I've argued is that childhood is evolution's way of solving the explore exploit trade-off. So we get this early period, one of the problems with exploring is if you're exploring, you're not exploiting, which means that you're not getting the calories and resources that you need. And I think the solution to this, and this is
Mm.
something that I've been working on a lot recently, is caregiving. So the solution is you have the children who are the scientists, who are the explorers, who are spending all their time learning. And then you have the caregivers, the mothers and fathers and elder siblings and parents and aunts and all the other people who are keeping the children alive and flourishing. And a really nice example of this that you mentioned is if you actually, even to get back to Sam Altman's point, if you look at the amount of calories that your brain is using, even when you're just standing here, your brain's using up 20% of your calories. It's an expensive computing gadget.
Hmm.
But when you were 4, 65% of your calories were going to your brain.
Such an
So I always
amazing
think
stat.
it's like, like the old Doctor Who science fiction series, like basically my 4-year-old grandson is this giant brain that is going around the world hypnotizing us and just
Yes.
getting us all to feed his brain. That's a good description of your average 4-year-old. And of course, some of that is literally, making peanut butter sandwiches and literally feeding that child's brain. But it's that process that enables those children to have as much brain plasticity to change the way their brain works. And one of the things that we know is a very characteristic and a kind of version of this explore-exploit trade-off is a trade-off between what people in neuroscience call plasticity and stability. So plasticity is how much can you change your brain when something new happens? And stability is how much can you keep your brain reliably the same so that you can do
Hmm.
something like, make a plan for 10 years from now, right? And there's a
Right.
trade-off between those so that you have children, young brains in general are very good at changing in the light of new experience. They're not as efficient. And then you get older brains where you have very efficient, effective, long distance connections that are really good at making things happen, not so good at changing when something new happens.
As you describe this, I mean, it's a really useful distinction. I was thinking as I was reading some of your work about this, that one great illustration of the kind of clash between these two modes is when politicians demagogue the federal budget and some piece of scientific research they found, where it's like they just spent $400,000 on a grant
Yeah.
to figure out like how hedgehogs reproduce, or what, and it's like, isn't that ridiculous, right? Because in the sort of exploit months, there's no task orientation. There's no
Right.
like usefulness of it, right? But all of science is like you have to do a lot of
Exactly.
exploration, because it may turn out that like an obscure hormone in the Komodo dragon is what ultimately solves obesity at scale, because that's actually how the research
Right.
started. So
Right.
that trade-off, even in modalities of human endeavor, is sort of is constantly there.
Yeah, and I think one way that we solve it is with this developmental trade-off. Another way is with a kind of division of labors. So one
Yeah.
of the things that I've said is it's not so much that kids are little scientists as scientists are big children, which most scientists sort of agree with. The scientists have the role that the children have of, look, we're going to give you, an academic salary and some research money to actually go out and do this kind of exploration. And it's just empirically turned out that that is the route to, extended life expectancy and prosperity and GDP
Right.
and all the other kinds of things that we want. I'm not sure it was obvious that that was going to turn out to be true, but it really has turned out to be true. And you're right that it's, what my picture is, what you would really want would be for the federal government and the granting agencies to be like those caregivers, be like those ideal moms that say,
Mm,
okay, here's some peanut butter sandwiches, here's a playground, here's some toys that you can play with, and now go and figure things out about the world. That may be
right.
too much to hope for.
Certainly now. When you describe this sort of mode, this sort of, the kind of, you know, the large-brained explorer that is the young child, it seems that whatever the models are doing and how they're learning,
Yeah.
we call it learning, and they are doing something that looks like learning because they are getting better at things.
Yeah.
They're sort of able to uh, ascend in skill level as at measurable levels. It's clear to anyone who's been using the models even over the last year that they are getting better. I mean, that's just very obviously evident. But whatever they're doing, it seems like it is not that. There's something
Right.
just completely like difference in kind of whatever the models are doing when they're learning and what a young child is doing when it's learning.
Yeah, that's true. That's certainly, there could be, and I think people are working on AI models that are more like children, but the models that everyone's paying attention to that get called artificial intelligence, like the large language models and large multimodal models, the chat GPTs, the Claudes, they're not doing that. And I think what they're doing is actually something that's extremely interesting and powerful, but very different from what children are doing when they're learning. What they're doing is taking all of the material that human beings have already learned, right? The reason why they're so effective is because they're taking everything that human beings have said and thought and put out on the net and understood. And then they use these statistical methods to try to organize and summarize and agglomerate that information. So it's not that they're going out into the world and figuring out things that are new the way that 2-year-olds are doing. What they're doing is taking all of the things that human beings have thought and learned and had ideas about, and then finding statistical patterns in that information. And again, that's not trivial. That's actually really important. And it's interestingly related to a feature of human intelligence that's really important, which is exactly that one of the things we can do is take advantage of all the other things that other human beings have learned. So our capacity for cultural learning is one of our really distinctive human capacities. And what we've done over the course of human history is to invent new ways of doing that. So if you think about um, writing, making pictures, printing, those are all examples of ways that we have of organizing information from other people in new ways. And that's an enormously important part of intelligence. But an example I gave is, look, me with the University of California, Berkeley Library, I'm orders of magnitude more intelligent than I would be if I didn't have access to the UC Berkeley Library, right? Not to mention if I didn't know how to read and so forth. But it's not like the UC Berkeley Library is intelligent. It's that humans plus,
Right.
it would be weird if you said, does the UC
Yep.
Berkeley Library know more than I do? Well, it has definitely, there's more information in there than I have in my head. And me plus that kind of source of information is a tremendous advantage. But it isn't that system is intelligent. That system is organizing and agglomerating a bunch of human intelligence. And I think that that's true. My colleagues and I have argued that's the way to think about the large models. And that's not a dismissive or debunking or they're just stochastic parrots view at all, because those new cultural technologies are actually the things that have transformed societies arguably more than any other technology we've ever had. So, print leads to
Right.
both the
Yes, good
Enlightenment
point.
and
Yes.
the French Revolution, right? And the wars of religion,
Right.
having information available, just internet search by itself is completely transformative for good and for ill. So this argument that says the way to think about those models is as this kind of new cultural technology taking advantage of all the things that human beings have done and said before, it's not saying that it's not important or it's not dangerous or it's not scary or it's not helpful. It's just saying the way to think about it is it's a new kind of tool that human beings can use. And, human beings plus tools, that's the whole history.
Right, but the aspiration the aspiration, the promise, right? I mean, the most extreme aspiration is that it will meet and then surpass human cognition.
Right.
And there's this age-old question about, well, what would that even mean? There's a very famous I think he was at Berkeley, John Searle, right, for years. Am I right about
Right.
that?
Right.
Very famous philosophical thought experiment that John Searle came up with, which I'll give a 30-second gloss on, called the Chinese box experiment, in which he says, imagine you're just watching a person who is sitting there and they have a bunch of Chinese characters and basically a set of rules of how to interpret them. And outside the box, you're sort of sending in questions in Mandarin and you're getting back answers in Mandarin because I'm sitting there, matching this picture with that picture
Right.
and showing it up
Right.
to you. Outside the box, it may look like I'm speaking Mandarin, but I'm not speaking Mandarin. That's
Right.
the short version of it. And there's a real question now, I think,
Mhm.
when we're thinking about the models, right? Which is it that all we're doing inside
Yeah.
is some sort of version of statistical prediction of pattern recognition with all the stuff we've gotten? Well, we're applying these kind of methods that spit out what I'm saying to you now, or and it's actually turns out we're actually pretty close to that thing that the models are doing, or they're just doing something fundamentally different.
Right.
And no matter
Right.
how good they get, what they're doing is always going to be distinct from the thing we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And certainly one of the things that's been really striking about the models is things that we might have thought relied on some of these human abilities to build models or build abstract theories about the world or go out into the world and actually experiment. It turns out that you can seem to do those things just by looking at statistical patterns in the data. So syntax, grammar, language. I think that has been a genuine surprise to everyone that you can apparently generate syntactic sentences and generalize them and make new ones just based on having a lot of statistical information about language. I'm not sure we knew that before. And I think one of the big things in the past couple of months that everyone is talking about that has made people feel as if there's a step change is that programming turns out to be something that the systems are good at doing. But of course, if you think about it, a program is also a language. And in some ways,
Yes,
it's
of
a
course. Yes.
simpler and more transparent language than syntax. I mean, it's just about what's happening internally and how you're manipulating symbols. And that's really important. I mean, that's an important part of human human intelligence. Having tools that can do that better is going to be tremendously useful. And again, the very idea of a computer itself, forget about AI and large models, is the idea that you can have a physical system that can manipulate symbols. That's like a big, big deal. That
Yes,
completely
exactly.
changes the way that we function in the world. But it's not the same thing as now we've got an intelligent person like the people around us. A way I like to illustrate this is think about, and I think this is important because the ways that we conceptualize these systems will affect how we talk about them, but also how we regulate them, how we think about them, what we do
Yeah.
about them. And one way of thinking about the systems, which I think is the prevalent one both within and outside of the community, or at least a prevalent one, is they're kind of like a golem, the rabbi of Prague and the golem that he invents, where there's something that's just made out of clay and you do some magic and it turns into a person. And these stories about the golem predate the Industrial Revolution, let alone the computational revolution. And I can tell you the TLDR is it never ends well. It's always a bad idea to do that.
Yes, right. Yes.
And that's the story that seems very natural. That's the story in Hollywood. That's the story that people often have of how these new systems work. Even saying an artificial intelligence is kind of telling you that story. I don't think that is a good description of what's going on. Here's an alternative story. Do you know the story of Stone Soup? So Stone Soup is a story about a bunch of visitors who come to a village and they say, we want some food. The villagers say, we can't share any food with you. And they say, okay, we'll make stone soup. And they get a big pot and put some stones in it. And they start boiling up the water. And then they say, this would be so much better if we had a carrot and an onion in it. But if we don't, we don't. And one of the villagers goes and gets a carrot and an onion. And then a little later, the visitors say, when we made this for the king, he put a chicken in. And one of the villagers goes and gets a chicken. And of course, by the time they're done, they've got this wonderful soup that is better than anything they could individually have made. And they say, God, it's amazing. These magical visitors made this soup just out of stones. So here's the AI version of this. There's a bunch of tech execs that go to the Village of Computer Users and they say, we're going to make artificial general intelligence just from next token prediction and gradient descent and transformers, just a few algorithms. And the users say, that's amazing. That's wonderful. You're going to do that? And they say, yeah, but it would be much better if we had more data. It really depends on having a lot of data. Do you guys have any data that you could give us? And all the users say, well, there's every book we've ever written, every story we've ever had, every picture we've ever put out on the internet. Sure, of course, we'll give you that. And the people say, yeah, it's getting more intelligent, but it still says a lot of stupid and obnoxious things. Could you do reinforcement learning from human feedback, which, by the way, is the thing that really has changed the way the models work? Reinforcement learning from human feedback is that the model produces some response, and then literally there's whole villages in Africa that are saying, no, that's good, or no,
Going
that's
through and saying
bad,
that's
or-
wrong. Yes.
Right, going through and saying that's wrong. Could you do that? And the villagers say, oh, yeah, we're happy. We'll have, we'll spend hours and hours saying whether it's wrong or right. And then finally they say, yeah, see, it's more and more intelligent, but it's still kind of saying stupid things. Could you do prompt engineering? So if you ask it in context way, with exactly the right prompt, then it will do better. And of course, the users say, yeah, we'll spend hours and hours doing prompt engineering, working this out. And then at the end of the process, the people say, oh yeah, look, see, we told you we made intelligence just from this computer is now artificially intelligent just from a few algorithms. When I said this at NeurIPS, which was one of the big AI conferences, Ted Chiang, who was there, said, yeah, but at least in the story, they don't sell the soup back to the villagers at an exorbitant price. But this is a debunking story partly, but again, it's a positive story. The positive story
Right, you do
is,
have soup in the end.
You do have soup, and by using these statistical methods to put together all of this amazing amount of information and knowledge that human beings have generated, you end up with something that can code, or that can pick out the patterns in reasoning, or can give you an answer to a search question in a very efficient way, and a lot of the time be accurate. So again, that's a big advance, like the same kind of advance as language itself, or pictures, or writing, or print, or television, or radio, or internet search, or libraries that actually enable you to extract all that information in an organized way from print. And those are big technological changes with big technological consequences, but they're not the same as, oh, okay, we made the golem come to life.
You just said reasoning, which is one of the things that I think is a really interesting area, because again, this is you always have to sort of distinguish between the kind of marketing and the tech.
Yeah.
Like they say, we have a reasoning model. It's like, well, is it actually reasoning?
My grandfather. So one of the things that I think is like, this is a different story, but one of the caregiving culture things that go together, I think, is that it's actually grandmothers, postmenopausal grandmothers are actually the way that human beings can learn so much, because those grandmothers are passing on cultural information. So my Yiddish grandfather always used to say, listen, honey, you ever hear a fish peddler yell, stale fish? And I think that's a good bit of wisdom for thinking about the AI companies. But I also think that there's a sincere belief behind this too.
Well, there's, again, all of this is difficult because there's the sales aspect of it. Then the sales aspect is actually encoded into the model. So when I ask, Claude to go, as I did recently, to sort of help me try to zero in on comparative homicide rates of different American cities in 1890, doesn't just do it, but it does these little, it gives you these little messages about what it's thinking.
Right.
So, okay, I'm going to go look at this. Oh, no, that, so and that is both a kind of interesting thing it's doing at a tech level, but is also a little bit of salesmanship,
Right.
because
Right.
it's announcing its thinking to you
Right.
to mimic. And with all of these technologies, we're always subject to the fact, there's a reason that the Turing test
Right.
is about modeling other minds, because we have such an impulse to
Right.
see around us the activity of other minds. It's why if you see a little wounded bird, you're like, oh, buddy, you like, you doing okay? You think about how that little bird is feeling about the world. You see faces in inanimate objects. So you're always kind of dealing with the fact that part of your brain is firing when you're interacting here. And also there's a very interesting tech happening.
Yeah.
And so there is this kind of those they're so bound together, and they're bound together intentionally.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. And I think it's interesting that if you think about this cultural technology idea, think about past ways that we passed on information from one group of people to another. It's interesting that actually these kind of fictional agents, kind of exploiting that theory of mind, is a very common way that we do it. So what do those grandmoms do? They tell stories, right?
Yes,
So
right.
they say, Peter Rabbit went into Mr. McGregor's garden when he wasn't supposed to, and here's the terrible thing that
Right.
happened. And that's a much more effective way of passing on information, exactly because, as you say, we're so oriented towards theory of mind. So when Claude says, oh, I'm trying to solve this problem for you. Oh, I just gave you completely the wrong answer. I'm so sorry about that. Let me
Yes,
try
exactly.
again, which is often,
Yes.
well,
Well, that's like
what it's
it's
doing.
like the moment I first I've told this story in the podcast before, but the moment I first was in San Francisco on book tour last year, and I took up my first Waymo, and I arrived at my destination, and without thinking, I got up and I said, thanks so much to the empty front seat before I exited the car, before catching myself, right? Because it's like that's both habit, but also it's like, well, someone drove me here. I had to, I got to say thank you. It's like
Right.
Claude saying sorry, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, there's two points. One of them is the tech point, and one of them is the interface point. So the tech point is that the way that the reasoning models work is very much like the general way that the systems work, which is find examples in the data of something like a person is solving a logic problem or a person is solving a math problem. Find all those examples of people solving logic problems, and there's tons of those out on the internet. Figure out what's the general pattern between what happens first and then what happens next and then what happens next, and then use that general pattern to generate a response. This gets back to kind of the Searle example. So if you think about, a kid in school who's learning how to multiply, and what happens is they learn how to say, okay, you put this number here, you put this number here, you put this other number here, and here's what comes out. You can do that without knowing that that has anything to do with
Exactly.
objects, or the fact that if you put three of them here 3 times, you're going to end up with 9. And that's much closer, I think, to what the systems are doing, which is why they can make characteristic mistakes, for instance, sort of surprisingly in things like arithmetic, because they're looking for the thing that is the most common sequence that has actually been done on the net. Now, again, teaching those kids how to do multiplication as an algorithm is really powerful. I mean, that's an important
Yes.
capacity that
Well,
we have.
And it's also the case that, I mean, to give that example, you talk about either children reasoning or children working through math. Like there's 2 things that come to mind. One is, reasoning, I think of as sort of a deep set of skills and attributes that are probably inherent to human
Right.
cognition. But, at different times in my life, I have been taught math and understood math in the kind of, I'm the guy manipulating the symbols in the Chinese box
Right.
experiment, which is I can
Right.
give you the right answer, but don't actually understand what I'm doing.
Right.
And then I've had moments, either through great math teachers or areas of math that I really love, where I got it in
Right.
this deep way. And I do think that, this is a side note, but math education in the US is not particularly good.
Yeah,
And there's
it's
just
terrible.
a lot of people essentially performing their own version of the Chinese box symbol manipulation and never actually getting that very satisfying feeling you get when you get the sort of depth of a mathematical concept. But in terms of reasoning, like if what they're doing is finding the kind of patterns around things that look like reasoning through problems, how do we develop that faculty,
Yeah.
from a very young age?
Yeah. So that's a great example. And I think the really fundamental difference between the way, so then people will sort of ask, well, okay, what's missing? If they're doing all these things just based on statistical analysis of the data, what's the thing that's missing? And I think the thing that's missing is the link to the outside world. So part of what it means when you understand something or when you reason about something is that you think that if you go completely outside of your own thought process and go out into the world, you're going to be able to send the rocket up to the moon because you figured out the math of how to get the rocket up to the moon. And you're going to have a really good test because you're going to see whether the rocket actually gets to the moon or not. And that's what I think is going on with kids all the time. So what kids, especially little kids, are doing all the time is going out, trying a hypothesis, thinking about a way the world could work, going out and experimenting and seeing whether that actually is the way it works, revising, changing what they think as a result. That's the way that is, at least is a way that human intelligence works. Now, another thing that we do is try and find the patterns in what other people are telling us or figure out how to do an algorithm in a math test. So that it's not like that never happens, but that kind of internal symbol manipulation is very different from the way that we interact with a world that's outside of us. Something that I say sometimes is that the LLMs are sort of Derrida's revenge, the sort of postmodernist idea that all you've got is the text and all you can do is move around in the text. That really is the life of that really is the life of a large model. And we don't just live in text. We don't just live in symbols. Those symbols are meaningful. Those symbols help us because of the way that they're related to the external world. And that's something that's very deeply characteristic of children. And one of the things, again, I think in a way, the conventional wisdom outside of the marketing within computer science, a lot of people like Jan LeCun is a good example.
He's made this point.
Have said, no, what we need for intelligence is world models. We need to have pictures of the world inside of our head, like causal models, theories, the kinds of things we have in science, the kinds of things kids have. And we need to be embodied in acting in the world. Those are the things that make our kind of intelligence really distinctive. Those are the things you see in infants. And those are exactly the things that are missing. Another nice way of putting it is my friend Jitendra Malik, who's a great computer scientist, says, they talk about these as foundation models. They're really super structure models because the foundation of our intelligence is the way that we interact with the world. And language, let alone the kind of printed language that we put out on the net, that's just like a little bit of icing on the top, right?
Yes.
And what these models are doing is just figuring out how that bit of icing at the top, how language itself works, and figuring out the patterns in language. And again, that's not trivial. It's really important.
That's very powerful. Yes.
Very powerful. Changes the way that we live in the world, for better or for ill. It has this wonderful effect of populating our world with mythical creatures like the characters in novels, or the people that are saints and spirits and gods and people who tell us what to do. That all comes from this capacity to think in terms of language, but it's not the same as the foundational kind of intelligence that we have as children.
That foundational intelligence, which is the embodied intelligence of the interaction with the physical world and the sort of the kind of the explorer, the kind of scientific experimentation thereupon, right? Like, what will happen if I put my finger in this socket, being a very common one of those experiments children like to run, that you're desperately trying to avoid them running when you're a parent. Is from a sort of methodological, I mean, I think sort of the fascinating question here, right, when we're getting back to these sort of questions about human essentials, is my reading of your research is that there's no need for some methodological instruction about the fundamental cognitive approach of trial and error and theorization to an infant, that is natural and inborn, that
Right.
we just do it. Is that a
Right.
right reading of it?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we're starting to think of some, formal computational ways that we could describe that and figure out what's going on that enables the kids to do that. And I could talk about that more. But exactly the point is that's what they're there for. That's what they're doing, and that's their function, is to have that kind of intelligence. Now, the kind of intelligence that we get when we read books, when we go to school, when we do all of these other kinds of superstructure kind of intelligence. That's not trivial. It's important. We need to do it. But it's building on these much more foundational, motivated things that we see with, with 2 and 3-year-olds. And I think there's a beautiful complementarity between the way that the children are just naturally driven to do this and the way that caregivers are giving them the opportunity to do that. And caregiving is very much
Hmm.
not like the way that we often think about teaching. It's not about manipulating
No, right.
people to come out a particular way. And in fact, if you're a good teacher, when you have your students, you don't want to manipulate them to end up knowing certain things or acting in certain ways. What you want to do is give them an environment in which they can do that exploration in a safe, thriving kind of way. So I think there's a lovely kind of complementarity between the little kids on the one hand and the grandmothers on the other hand, both of whom, of course, are completely ignored and low rent and low status in the world compared to, the heads of big AI companies.
Well,
They're the ones who are really accomplishing this amazing human task.
yeah, you have a line about how it's the prepubescent and the postmenopausal
Yeah.
humans that are the most human.
Yeah.
They're in their most. Explain that concept, which I love, and has stuck with me ever since I first encountered it.
So one of my lines is that basically we're human up till puberty and after menopause, and in between we're basically just glorified. We're glorified apes. What we're doing is all the things like trying to find mates and finding resources and finding our way in the pecking order. I used to
And
be
status dominance and
yeah, exactly. I used to be much meaner about that. So I used to sort of say, well, the 35-year-olds think they're the apex of life, but really they're just going out and doing all these boring baboon kind of things. Now that my children are in their 40s, I have the opposite view. So my view now is, oh my God, those poor 35-year-olds,
yes.
if they want to think they're really hot stuff, that's fine. Let them think that. Let them think they're the center of the universe, because their lives are just getting and striving and getting and striving more and getting and striving more and never being satisfied, and the mates never show up the way you want them to, and it's always someone higher in the hierarchy. And in the meantime, right, the grandmoms and the little kids are sitting in the background, and we're doing all the fun stuff. We're telling stories, we're reading books, we're figuring out theory of mind. So now I sort of feel like, okay, it's okay, guys. You could have a high opinion of yourselves.
It's a profound observation. I mean, I think it registered that, and I think part of what I, sometimes in the midst of my, my daily primate life, when I'm going around sort of gathering resources and wondering where I am in the status hierarchy, and thinking about my mate and my children and my my territory and all these things. I do have these daydreams about like the times in my life when I could do more exploring, right? Where I could
Yeah.
do more, this podcast in some ways is a little bit of a playpen for me for that reason. And I think that one of the things that I take away from that or think about is both in education
Hmm.
and in adult life, like how quickly we get divorced from our explorer intelligence, how much that gets sublimated and choked out of us, how little it's encouraged, but also how important it is, because all the big important stuff that happens, like the really big stuff that happens in human development, I mean, as us as a civilization or as a species,
Yes.
is explorer intelligence,
Right.
right? Like
Yeah.
that's where the big stuff happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think an interesting thought about kind of how did this particular strange form of intelligence evolve is it's what people in computer science call the non-stationary environment. So as long as we've been around, one of the things that's characteristic about humans is that our environment keeps changing because we keep changing it. So every generation, we do things to our environment, both physical and social, that make it different from what it was just a generation before. And I think it's actually children and teenagers and young people often who are the kind of cutting edge of that kind of change. But what that means is that we have to keep readjusting both our knowledge, what we think, what we believe about the world, and our values, what we think are our objectives and our goals based on the fact that now we're in a place that's different from the place that we were before. And again, that's a big contrast with the large models who are trained on a particular stationary data set. And then it takes a lot of work to be able to get them to understand what's going on in a new environment. So, an example that I like is if you had a pre-trained model in 1980 and you asked it, could a man marry another man? Of course, it would say no, and that would be the right answer in 1980, given everything that you had read and everything that was on the web and everything that was in the legal code. Um, that ability to say, no, maybe that's not right. Maybe we should have a different kind of structure. That's something that I think really comes with the explore side. And one of the things that's nice about being a human adult is I think it's really interesting that we have all these ways, these kind of divisions of labor, even in our own lives, where we have something like a religious retreat or a sabbatical or just an evening
Yes.
spent reading a novel that are
Yes.
all ways that we segregate. Okay, here's an explore period. Here's how I'm going to be lifted out of the immediate primate requirements for a weekend or an evening or, some other
Or a
time. And
year. Yeah.
then a year, and then we can get back to the exploit part. And of course, science is a really good example of that. But I think you can see the same thing throughout history when people think, okay, now I'm going to go out and explore something else. Although I must say, we've had a very good example recently of how, for example, trying to do a lot of ketamine and restructure the federal government at the same time is really a bad idea. I mean, you really need to segregate your
I think it's,
going off
believe
and
me,
exploring.
I think if we could turn the clock back and give him a year sabbatical, I think that would have been, I genuinely think that would have been great.
Yeah.
I think great for all involved, great for him, great for the country, great for everyone. Maybe I'll sort of end here because I have to say at an emotional level, I'm both sort of drawn to and repulsed by the AI conversation, and the degree to which I'm repulsed is because it gives me often, quote, the bad feeling. Like it almost at the level of my sort of somatic system, it spikes my cortisol and it stresses me and it makes me anxious
Yeah.
and worried because there is this kind of creeping sense of, it's a little like I feel like we're going through our version of the nuclear discourse, sort of
Yeah.
post Hiroshima in the nuclear age. What is this new technology? Have we created the thing that can end all life on the planet? And that ends up being the arc of the human story is, we build these tools and the tools defeat us. And one thing that I've really enjoyed about reading your work and listening to your other podcasts, but this conversation is that it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, so I don't just characterize your views, but that I feel like you have a sort of deeply humanist approach to all this in which you think what the models are doing is genuinely a new thing that is powerful and interesting. And also that it's so distant and sort of definitionally remote from what we as humans are doing that
Right.
it doesn't threaten us at our core in the way that I think some people think it does.
Yeah. So I think the Gollum story, is such a pervasive, seductive story and always ends up badly, exactly because we sort of
Yeah.
appropriately feel that we don't want to have mechanical or non-human things out in the world that are like humans. Now, it has to be said that the cultural technology story, the technology story in general, take the nuclear example, is not that every time we have a new technology, it's great and it's wonderful and we use it and we figure out how to do it. I think a
No.
really important But I do think that if we were thinking about how have we done this in the past? How have we dealt with big changes in the ways that we accumulate information? Um, well, kind of boring things. We have regulation, we have copyright, we have libel law, we have,
Yeah.
Chris, we have your profession, right? We have
Right.
the
Yeah.
idea that journalists should have a code of ethics. All of those are
Yep.
things that we develop to be able to use these cultural technologies of things like print and media in a way that was for the good and not for the bad. And whenever I think actually the really interesting change happened without any of us quite noticing around 2000, all those means of communicating that we'd had before all turned into bits. So just around 2000 is when you get HTTV, you get the first PDF, you get the
Yep.
first
Everything.
MP3. Everything turns into bits, which means that all the information we've ever had is instantaneously transmissible and infinitely reproducible. And that's a giant phase change in the way that we think about information. And as I say, if you look back, one of my favorite books about this is Robert Darnton actually went and read all the pamphlets that were printed in the 18th century in France. And you'll be amazed to hear that the first thing that people did was to produce a lot of libelous misinformation, a
Yes,
lot of libelous
exactly.
pornography. It was the first thing that
Exactly.
happened, and it had consequences, as in
Yeah.
the French Revolution, but it also had consequences, as in Benjamin Franklin and Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson distributing that information. The Declaration of Independence was printed before it was considered by the Congress. People could actually access that information. And I think the challenging thing is to look at those past examples and see, how did we end up not having an explosion of misinformation? How did we end up not having 2 or 3 companies controlling everything that we read in the newspaper, which was sort of the
Yeah.
equivalent of where we are now? How did we end up not having tremendous economic gaps between the people who produce the information, the content, and then the people who distribute it, which I think is a very vivid economic issue at the moment. So there are ways that human beings can do that. It's not that there's a golem that's appearing that is, going to take over in this kind of creepy way, but it is also not, oh, they're stochastic parrots, we don't have to worry about them, they're not going to do anything. If you think about these past examples of changes in the way that we communicate or changes in the way that we get information from others, those are really, really important. And we, as human beings, have the agency to decide how are we going to use those tools? What are those tools going to be like? How do we have social organization that things like legislation or norms or rules or things about how the systems work themselves that will make them help us to
Yeah.
thrive the way previous technologies have, and not bring us to an end, at least in the way that previous technologies haven't done yet. Let's put it that
Yes, in the
way.
in the short to medium term, when considered in the span of humanity. Alison Gopnik is a distinguished professor of psychology, affiliate professor of philosophy at UC Berkeley. She's a cognitive scientist, the author of many articles and books. What a great pleasure! It was really wonderful to have you on. Thank you.
Well, that was a great conversation, Chris. I really, really enjoyed it.